We went, my brother and Raymond Walmsley and myself and his wife, Catherine, went out. And my brother Raymond kept saying to me, Marcella, look to your right at the light in the sky. And I kept walking, and he said, no, you've got to see this. It's not a plane. I kept walking. And when I got to the car, I had my daughter, Tina, which was about 3 years old at that time. And I reached for the door handle. And when I reached for the door handle on the car, I saw this figure. And from somehow, I was looking, holding onto the door handle. And I started at the feet. And I came up with my eyes looking up. And I could see, I saw no feet. But I saw a grayish cast. And I kept going up, looking up at this creature. And it had wings like a bird with its neck stuck down and stood in a position like this. At that point, I turned and tried to run back towards the house. And when I did, I couldn't walk. And I laid there on top of my daughter, which I could hear her crying. So that by that time, I could hear my brother in the background hollering, come on, Marcella, get up, come on, hurry. So I went back with him, and then we went in the house. And after we got in the house, it hit the door. He came to the door and tried to get in the door, which they had locked. And I was just in and out. They took me to a sofa and laid me down on the sofa. But I just couldn't. I couldn't grasp what I saw. I knew it was nothing from this earth. I knew that the creature, whatever it was, didn't live here.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Cryptids and Cases. Now, you might notice that this episode is being published on Friday, and I usually do them on Tuesdays, but due to some changes in my husband's work schedule, it's just more convenient for me to do them on Friday now instead of on Tuesday. So hopefully you guys don't mind that. Maybe you can open up your weekend with some good old cryptids and cases if you want. But for now, that's just how it's going to be. We'll just upload every other Friday. Now, today we are back with the cryptid segment of this podcast, which you know I really enjoy. I love discussing spooky and strange things, and discussing the Hat Man last week was such a cool experience, and I had so many interesting discussions about it with you guys. I can't figure out which you guys like best, the true crime cases or the cryptid ones. The true crime episodes so far have gotten the most downloads, but the cryptid cases get the most correspondence with you guys. Of course, I don't have a lot of episode data to go off of, but it's been interesting to see the response with what I do have. I was a little concerned because while I love true crime as well as creepy, cryptid, paranormal things, not everyone likes them both. A lot of people are diehard fans of one or the other, so I wasn't sure how this podcast would be received since it mixes both of those. I'm super relieved, though, that it seems to have interest on all angles, and I'm really thankful that you guys have tuned in to my episodes so diligently. I especially notice those of you that are messaging me a lot or that seem to really listen every single week. That's super awesome, so thank you so much. Like I said in my introduction episode, I'd still put this episode out even if only my dog listens to it, but it's really amazing to see that it's being listened to by you guys. All right, enough of my yapping. Let's get into this episode. I feel like I say this about all of the episodes so far, but I really am excited about this one. This cryptid is my favorite by far. If the title hasn't given it away, we are going to dive into the legend known as the Mothman. I first became a fan of the Mothman when I watched the movie The Mothman Prophecies. It's so good, and it details basically a man that is receiving strange calls from this foreboding voice, and in the movie, tragedies are predicted by the strange voice, and the man tries to intervene, but of course, most people think he's out of his mind. It's a really good movie, and you should go check it out. I'd known about the Mothman before the movie, but I didn't know the full scope of the cryptid, so it was a really interesting watch. I'm pretty sure it's from the early 2000s, like 2002, so some of the special effects are a little wonky, but it's still super creepy, super interesting. Just go see it. A few months after watching the movie, my mom and I actually got to stop by Point Pleasant, West Virginia on the way home from a family visit, which is where the Mothman originated. Half of my family is from the mountains of West Virginia, so it was really cool to briefly be there and find that such a prominent cryptid came from there. Point Pleasant is a really cute little town with a few shops, a Mothman museum, which was really cool, and a Mothman monument. The day that we stopped by, it was overcast and gave this really cool, gloomy, spooky vibe to the whole town. It definitely had this chilling atmosphere to it, and it was easy to slip into an eerie mindset as I looked at the surrounding mountains and visited the landmark of the fallen Sulphur Bridge, which was also featured in the Mothman Prophecies movie. Now, it was in 1966 that the first two stories of the Mothman emerged near this small town. The first story involved 5 men who worked as gravediggers for a cemetery. They said that late one night during their work, they saw a large human-shaped dark figure moving quickly from tree to tree above their heads. They reported that it had large wings and was quite big. Then, a few days later, 2 couples named Roger and Linda Scarberry, along with their couple friends, Steve and Mary, had been hanging out at a decommissioned World War II munitions depot, named by the locals as the TNT area. Since it was abandoned, but also near town, it had become a popular hangout spot for young adults to swing by and talk, visit, drink, do whatever it is that young folks did at the time. The 2 couples then piled into the car and they set out on State Route 62. While driving, the group stated that they saw a large figure looming ahead on the road. They described it as a large flying man with 10-foot wings with glowing red eyes. They also said that the creature seemed to avoid their headlights. Panicked, Roger slammed on the gas and attempted to drive away from the creature. To their dismay and their surprise, the creature began to follow them. While they reported that it seemed to be a little clumsy on its feet, it had no trouble gliding behind them. The car was said to have reached 100 miles per hour, and the creature had no problem keeping up with them. I don't know about you guys, but at that point, I'd be calling my family and telling them that I love them because I'd be certain that I was about to take part in an alien abduction against my will. Also, why does it feel like every good, scary story begins with a couple in a car on a dark road? Note to self, do not drive after sunset, especially not down some little country road that nobody knows about. After the couples returned home, they reached out to local radio stations and media to tell their story. Of course, they were met with a lot of skepticism. If I had been told that story by someone, I admit I probably would have raised a brow or two as well. While I'm super interested in stories like this, as I've mentioned before, I'm also a skeptic. I always try to look for an explanation to a story and try to debunk what I can. Roger did acknowledge that his story seemed pretty fantastical, especially coming from a tiny little community in Appalachia in the 1960s. He stated, though, that what he had witnessed couldn't have been a figment of his imagination. He reported to the newspapers, quote, "If I had seen it while by myself, I wouldn't have said anything. But there were 4 of us who saw it." Close quote. Reportedly, the local sheriff took note of their sighting and accompanied them back to the abandoned plant. He said that while he didn't spot this new Mothman, he did see a few shadows circling the plant, and a large object actually flew from the rafters of the boiler room when they opened the doors to go inside. As you can imagine, it took no time for the news article reporting on the Mothman to be spread nationwide. The title of the article read, "Couples See Man-Sized Bird, Creature, Something." After this sighting, reports of the Mothman began to pop up all over the region. However, one wildlife biologist, Robert L. Smith from West Virginia State University, didn't buy into the creature being some mythical being. Instead, he reasoned that the Mothman could be a large heron he called a sandhill crane. Those particular cranes are nearly as tall as a man and have a 7-foot wingspan. The only thing about that hypothesis is that those cranes aren't native to the area of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. However, Robert L. Smith explained that there was a chance that one of them had simply gone off their migration course. Stories continued to pop up in the region one after the other. In fact, there were an estimated 100 reports that occurred after this sighting from November 1966 to December 1967. I will play a few of those encounters for you here, some from back in the day, and some that are a little bit more modern.
I decided to ride that evening, just riding around. There was a very bright moon, and we were just riding around. And I said, "Want to grab through TNT area?" And I said, "Yeah, everybody." So we're riding out through there, and I remember, you know how guys will mess around.
Right.
Well, the moon was so bright that just, I guess, out of boredom, I turned the headlights off on the motorcycle and dodged chuck holes by the moonlight. So we're riding out through there, and I said, "Look at that." And we stopped, and up on top, on the roof of that old power plant building, it was, I believe, a 3-story building.
Yeah, it was.
And up on top, we seen 2 big, what looked like red eyes, looking at it. We sat there and looked at it. I said, "Let's go out and see who it is." He said, "Yeah." So we went out there. Well, we stopped at, right there underneath the building.
Made like an entranceway.
Yeah, we stopped right there, and we looked up. Well, it looked like these eyes were looking down at us then. So, well, it just as though it had a head, a large head sitting on its shoulder. Then it very slowly and precisely turned towards the catwalks. Could hear its footsteps in the glass right in front of us. And then when it started walking on the catwalk, never a hesitation. Kept on walking. Then we heard that sound like wings.
I thought it was a helicopter. Couldn't hear any noise at all.
Right.
But that far away. But then as it rose over the trees and proceeded to make the big circles over, how birds fly.
Right.
It started out, I would say, 500 feet in the air. But every time it'd make a circle, I could see it when it came in front of my car. It would come lower and lower. Now, the last pass it made was probably 75 feet over my car.
I could see it wasn't a man, that it looked more like a bird. Instead of arms, they were like wings.
I had a huge wingspan on it. It was at least 10 feet.
So we get to the top of the hill, off of the gravel road, and the road keeps going down over the hill. Well, we pull in to the right, we go in and we turn around and face out. He gets a quilt out of the back of the car, and we put it on the hood of the car. And we climb up on the car hood, and we're sitting there and getting to know each other a little bit, And we've only been there about probably 10 minutes. It's starting to get dark. You can see the the stars starting to come out through that grove of trees. And I notice, I'm talking to him, he's turning to the right, looking at something. And I'm like, "What are you looking at?" And he said, "See that star over there? It looks weird." And I said, "Yeah, it does." And it was, if you hold your hand straight out and raise it just a little bit, it wasn't real far up, but it looked like it might have been if you see a planet, it looked like it might be that. But then it kept pulsating. It would go in and then get a little bit bigger each time. And he said, "I've been watching that thing ever since we got here, about 10 minutes. Just about that time, it made one of those big pulses, and it came right through the clouds, and the whole sky was beautiful. It was shades of pink and red, and it just like it was boiling. This thing came through the clouds. And to me now, back then I didn't think about it, but now I think it reminded me of what you would think of a supernova, this explosion. But I also think it was coming through a dimension. And it burst through the clouds, and it just sit there. And if you think of a supermoon, that's about the size of it. I mean, it got pretty good size, and it kept growing. and it was coming closer to us each time. And the thing, it was closer than realized, or that we realized. We could see it, and we just sat in awe and looked at it. Suddenly, it started to move. Well, the thing is reddish orange, real bright, and all the area around it seemed to be encompassed with this color. It was beautiful, it really was. And I was too enthralled looking at it to really be very afraid. And it came to the edge of that grove of trees and stopped right at the gravel road that we had come in on. And it was about treetop high. And when it finally stopped there at the road, it was immense. And it wasn't giving off any sound. There was no heat or anything from it. All it was at this time was a huge ball of light. So he said, "You better get in the car." Of course, we're just still sitting there, and I got my mouth open looking at it. It just all of a sudden started coming toward us. And we're out in the middle of this field. We're back about 50 yards from the road, and it's traveling really slow. And it comes up and over the car. And it is so big. When you raise your head and look at it, all you can see underneath is light. Now, when it came toward us, and I've heard other people say this too, but when it came toward us, it was a ball. And when it got on top of us, it was flat with a dome. This time it was still red. I'm just trying to understand what it is. The next thing I remember, we're both in the car, and I'm on the passenger side, and he's behind the wheel. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and we both look up. And I lean out of the car windows are down. I lean out the window, and I'm looking up, and I see the bottom of this thing, and it's making noise, like just a real kind of a sucking noise, but nothing real loud. And there's no heat, but there's lots of light. The whole area where we're sitting is all lit up. The inside of the car is lit up. All around it's lit up. He tries to start the car. He said, "We're getting out of here." He has a little bit of trouble getting us started. He starts to pull out. And as he pulls out, the object starts to move. And it moves from our lower left in front of the car at the bumper is this creature standing, and it jumps in the air, and it flies from left to right just in front of us. And I'm like, "What's that?" And, he pulls out so fast, and he's turning left, and he's riding, and he said, "It's a UFO." And I said, "No, what is that? Didn't you see that creature?" And it was man-like. It was about 8 feet tall. That's how I just tried to think about what it looked like. Grayish black. It had its arms back. It had wings, but I called it arms. And it reminded me of how Superman would look. You know how, if you're familiar with Superman, he just took a jump and he was gone. How this thing did. It did not flap its wings. It did not make any noise. It flew right just almost over the top of the hood of the car from left to right and up into the trees. And my boyfriend's driving, and turning left out of the field, and we're bouncing all over the place. And I'm hanging out the passenger side. And back then we didn't have seatbelts. And I'm like, "Look at that thing. He said, I'm trying to get us out of here, Linda." And I can remember hearing the gravels of that car, the wheels, the gravels were flying everywhere, and the UFO's flying over top of us, and it goes straight down over the hill. And the creature goes to the right up in the trees, stops, and turns around. It is dark enough. It was like you've been outside when there is moonlight and you can see through the trees. That's the kind of thing it was at the passenger window. And he's driving as fast as he can get down that road. And I said, did you see that?" He said, "Yeah, I saw it. It's a UFO." And I said, "Well, yeah, but didn't you not see the creature?" And he said, "I didn't see a creature." And I said, "Well, let's go on down the road here there was a strip mine down there, and they weren't working down there anymore, but it was an abandoned place where we could pull off to the left." I said, pull in here and let's get calmed down. I want to tell you what I saw. And then I want to go back up there because I know it's sitting up there in the trees and I want you to see it. So we get down there and we pull in like we did off of the gravel road and into the strip mine. And we turn around and he said, what'd you see? And I said, when you started the car, there was a creature standing there right to your left. And it flew up over the hood of the car and it flew up in the trees to the right across the road there. And I said, I think it was that Mothman thing. And he said, I don't know, Linda. I didn't see it, but, we got ourselves calmed down. I said, I think I want to go home. I just want to go home.
As I'm standing in the exact location right now to where the Mothman sighting took place right here in North Carolina just a little over 2 weeks ago. Dallas and Teresa, I will not give their last name, said they were down here visiting some family, and on the way back home, they decided to pull into this old graveyard and just walk around. It was just before dark when they got right about here, and I'm going to turn the phone around so you can see. When they got right about here, Teresa was the first one to see it. She said that sitting right there on top of that old shack was a man/bird-looking creature. She said it actually made her jump. She reached over, hit her husband, and she said, what is that? He turned and looked at his head, and Dallas said just as soon as he saw it, that thing stood up real quick and went straight up in the air, okay? Now, from what they described, when Teresa first saw it, she said it looked to be about 3.5 to 4 foot tall, like it was squatted down, completely covered in fur, and it had very large wings on it. She said it didn't have no neck. It was just a head. That's all it was. Dallas said that when he saw it, he described it to a T, just like she did, that it stood up, and just as soon as it stood up, it took off. I said, when it stood up, how tall did it look? He said it looked to be about 6 foot, which is, right at my height. So, I can't swear up and down it was the Mothman. They can't either. But from the way they described it, it fits it to a T.
Now, as well as those experiences back whenever things were really going on in 1966, 2 volunteer firefighters also reported a sighting of their own, detailing what they called a very large bird with large red eyes. There was also a report that detailed a German Shepherd dog and his owner, Newell Partridge. The sighting took place about 90 miles from Point Pleasant. Newell reports that he was sitting in his home and watching the TV when the screen began to flicker on and off and made a strange buzzing sound before losing power. He also heard a really strange sound that seemed to be coming from outside. At this point, it was about 10:30 p.m. Newell grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate what could have happened when he spotted 2 large glowing red eyes in the nearby distance. At this point, his German Shepherd had also seen the figure and began to bark and howl. Newell says that his dog took off after the figure and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. A few minutes passed before he heard the dog cry out, and unfortunately, he never saw his dog again. On November 16th of that same year, in fact, it was the next night, another sighting occurred. Marcella and Bennett Wamsley were taking a drive near the abandoned plant in order to visit a friend. They parked and got out of the car, but froze when they noticed a silhouette of a human-shaped figure standing behind a different car. Marcella reported that it slowly began to rise from the ground and had those signature glowing red eyes. Too scared to continue with their visit, the couple got back into their car and quickly drove away. They reported their sighting to the sheriff's office, where no answers were given. A little more than a year after the first initial reporting in November of 1966, the sightings seemed to come to a halt. For some reason, in Point Pleasant, the Mothman went from being seen very regularly to all of a sudden just disappearing. Just as the tales of the Mothman were growing scarce, one woman had a report of an eerie dream. She was speaking to a reporter about the Mothman and detailed this story in her interview. About the dream, she says, quote, "There were lots of people drowning in the river, and Christmas packages were floating everywhere in the water. It's like something awful is going to happen." Close quote. Unfortunately, her strange premonition was right. On December 15th, 1967, one of the eye-bar pins in the Silver Bridge failed, which was a large and prominent bridge that tied Point Pleasant to the land across the river. The bridge failed a little after 5 p.m., meaning that there was rush hour traffic on the bridge and plenty of cars that were stalled there waiting in the traffic. Car after car tumbled into the icy river below, and 46 people died as a result of this collapse, making it one of the most devastating incidents in the area. Just as the dream had predicted, the water was filled with survivors, the drowned, and the Christmas presents that the passerbys had in their submerged vehicles. Because of this tragedy and the coincidental sudden lack of Mothman experiences, locals began to believe that the cryptid was tied to the incident somehow. One of the witnesses of the collapse insisted that they saw the Mothman perched on the bridge just before it broke apart and plunged into the water. That was the last report of the Mothman for quite some time. He wasn't seen in Point Pleasant after the incident, not for decades. Despite the activity seeming to halt in the tiny town in West Virginia, there arose plenty of reports of the Mothman not just all over the country, but all over the world. Just as noted before, it seemed that the Mothman would make himself known just before a mass tragedy occurred. Because of this, the Mothman quickly became a bad omen, whose presence in an area meant that a horrific event was on the horizon. A few workers at the nuclear plant in Chernobyl allegedly reported seeing a moth-like figure just days before the explosion. They said that they had seen him flying around the plant or hovering over it. The workers that had encountered that being said that they were then plagued by nightmares and harassed by endless weird phone calls. The creature came to be called the Black Bird of Chernobyl. Now, these reportings are also said to be fabricated after the emergence of the Mothman Prophecies movie, so take that with a grain of salt. Still creepy, though. Another thread between the Mothman and tragedy was woven in Mexico. Right before the swine flu outbreak in Mexico, many locals in the Chihuahua region mentioned seeing a figure on April 10th, 2019 that was very hairy, tall, and had 2 large wings with blood red eyes. One of the residents who wanted to remain anonymous also claimed to have been chased by the Mothman relentlessly. During this time, the area began to see a huge rise in the swine flu cases as well. 5 days before the 9/11 attacks, there were reports that locals had seen a large, dark, crane-like figure near the towers. On the actual day of the attack, there were also a few reports that he was seen moving through the smoke and ash in New York. The Silver Bridge also wasn't the only bridge to be associated with the Mothman either. During rush hour, once again, on August 1st, 2007, a bridge on Interstate 35 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, gave way at the center, killing 13 people and injuring 145. Reports began to come forward stating that the Mothman had been seen on multiple occasions on the nights leading up to that collapse. The creature was dismissed to be a heron or crane by those who refused to buy into the Mothman craze, but witnesses stood firmly by what they thought they saw. When it comes to Point Pleasant, though, it seemed that the Mothman is almost finished with that area. Despite it being so prevalent for over a year and starting at Point Pleasant, there haven't been a lot of stories that have risen from Point Pleasant, at least enough that are notable. I did notice, however, that a new sighting popped up in Point Pleasant in 2016, which was nearly 5 decades after the first sighting of the Mothman. As reported by West Virginia newscaster Kathy Anderson, a man called into the WSAZ news station one Sunday to report that he saw the Mothman while driving on Route 2 in Point Pleasant. The man, who only recently moved to the city, reportedly was not even aware of the legend prior to snapping 3 photos of what certainly appears to be the Mothman. I will upload these photos on the podcast social media when I announce that the episode is out so that you can see them for yourself, but they definitely look eerie. Oddly enough, I checked my trusty Snopes website that's usually pretty good at debunking internet allegations, and the status of the photos being legit was unproven rather than just strictly debunked or false. I don't know, check out the pictures and tell me what you think. Do you think that they were manipulated or photoshopped? Do you think this was just some person trying to drum up Mothman news around the 50th anniversary of the first sighting? Is it a hoax? Is it real? What are we thinking? Either way, the images are creepy, whatever the case. Now, I was doing my research, and we know that the Mothman has popped up, allegedly, at a lot of different locations around the world. But for a while, it didn't seem that he was staying at a certain place for a length of time, at least not like he did in Point Pleasant. The reports at Chernobyl and in Chihuahua, Mexico, and other places like that say that they saw him for a few days before a tragedy, whereas in Point Pleasant, he was there for over a year. I thought that Point Pleasant was the only place that has had consistent reports of the Mothman, but I was actually really shocked to find that he's also pretty heavily tied to Chicago as well, with reports dubbing him the Mothman of Chicago. According to allthingsinteresting.com, rumors about a Mothman creature near Chicago first surfaced in 2011, as documented by self-described Fortean researcher Lon Strickler on his website Phantoms and Monsters. There are now more than 100 archival posts on the site, which appears to relay different encounters with the Chicago Mothman. The first post was made on October 13th, 2011, with the title, Photo, Second Mothman / Bat-like Object Witnessed Over Chicago. In it, a witness describes an encounter he'd allegedly had on August 22nd of that year. According to the witness, he was traveling through the suburbs of Chicago when he came across a local business with a tall sculpture of a Native American perched on its roof. He stopped to snap a photo of the sculpture and then drove home. Later that night, as he went through his photos, the man noticed what appeared to be a giant winged creature flying in the background of the shot. He said, quote, "At first I didn't think nothing of it. I figured it was a plane or something. But just for the heck of it, I enlarged it. It looked something similar to a bird or a bat, but then again it doesn't. So I have no idea what it could be." Close quote. I will reference allthingsinteresting.com again, where another story came forward from a college student. That story reads as follows. Quote, "The anonymous witness wrote that night they were in their apartment when they suddenly heard their roommate scream. They ran into the roommate's room to check on her and found her cowering in the corner, white as a ghost and shaking. Once the roommate had calmed down, she explained that as she was getting dressed, she had seen a pair of glowing orange eyes staring at her through her window, despite the fact that their apartment was on the 3rd floor. She said she was filled with this overwhelming feeling of complete and total terror," the witness wrote. She felt like the creature was looking at her as though she was prey. She said she felt like a rabbit that was about to be pounced upon by an eagle. Around this time, the witness's boyfriend called, and it sounded like he was out of breath. The student says, "As I tried to get him to slow down, I walked past my roommate's open door, and to my absolute horror, I saw a pair of glowing red eyes looking through the window right at me. They stared at me for about 3 to 4 seconds before whatever it was abruptly left. Like my friend, I totally lost it and screamed at the top of my lungs." These two stories weren't the only Mothman sightings to come out of Chicago. AllThat'sInteresting.com states the following, quote, "Since 2011, reports of the Chicago Mothman have continued to pour in. Alleged witnesses have claimed to see the creature everywhere, from the Willis Tower to O'Hare Airport to the suburbs. In 2017 alone, there were as many as 55 alleged sightings throughout the Chicago area. And before long, Even large publications like Vice were reporting on the phenomenon. This group of sightings is historical in cryptozoology terms, Strickler told Vice in an interview. For one, it's happening in an urban area for the most part, and that there are so many sightings in one period. Strickler also told the publication that he believes there are not one, not two, but at least 3 humanoid creatures flying around Chicago, based on the locations in which they were spotted and small differences in eyewitness testimonies. One witness went on record with Vice describing a Chicago Mothman encounter he'd allegedly had while working a Friday night security shift at a bar called The Owl. He says, "I saw a plane flying, but also something moving really awkwardly under it. It didn't look like a bat so much as what illustrations of pterodactyls look like, with the slenderness of its head and its wing shape. I know what birds and what bats look like. This thing didn't have any feathers or fur, and it didn't fly like anything I've ever seen." He said that he'd left his phone charging at the bar that night and immediately thought to himself, "This was the worst time in the world to have my phone charging." Like many others, he contacted Lon Strickler with his story and found out he was just one of the 55 people that year who had experienced the same thing. As he's documented these reports, Strickler has noted a number of similarities between the Chicago Mothman sightings and the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, with one notable exception. He says, "These beings are less aggressive than the one in Point Pleasant for the most part." So there have been quite a few sightings of the Mothman as we've covered, but what is it? Is it truly this mythological being that is a harbinger of doom? Is it a bad omen? Is it just a sandhill crane like Robert L. Smith said? A University of Chicago psychologist, Dr. A. Gallo, spoke about his opinion of the Chicago Mothman sightings. His research focuses mostly on memory and how people actively, and sometimes inaccurately, reconstruct the past. He refers to Strickler, who again hosts the Phantoms and Monsters website and was collecting all of the Mothman reports. About him, Dr. David says, "When people are choosing to report sightings, the basis of data upon which your paranormal researchers are collecting is all self-report." He said, "Strickler is not sampling random people and asking if they saw the Mothman. He's just counting the number of people that voluntarily came forward to report a sighting." He goes on to say, "Those people coming forward with reports, people who are likely to visit a paranormal site like Phantoms and Monsters, may also be more inclined to believe in a Mothman. Therefore, they may also be more inclined to believe that they have witnessed one." He goes on to say, "There's a phenomenon where there's basically some real witnessed experience, but if there are holes or gaps in that original experience, sometimes the mind is unable to fill those gaps. If something is suggested to them subsequently as a plausible scenario, like a Mothman or whatever, that person might be inclined to fill in the gaps with that." Strickler, however, disagrees with this, of course, calling all of his reports genuine. He continues to document sightings in Chicago to this day. So what do you guys think? Do you think the Mothman is explained away by people just buying into the hype and conjuring up their own stories? Do you think it's a case of complete lies in general? Is it truly a crane, an error in someone's memory, or is it something else completely? I'll be honest, though this is my favorite cryptid in the world, I can't say for sure if I think that it's real. I think that would definitely be interesting, and I definitely can relate to those people who swear that they have seen something they can't explain. I do believe that the two couples in 1966 really did see something, just based off of their interviews and the way that they sounded. I really don't think that they're lying. Do I think that it was some sort of cryptid like the Mothman that they saw? I'm not too sure about that. My mind is open to the possibility of cryptids and creatures, but I remain hesitant to buy into a lot of it. Feel free to tell me what you guys think about this cryptid. Do you have any stories of your own? Do you have any commentary that you want to add? As always, feel free to leave a comment or message for me on my Cryptids and Cases Facebook page, Instagram, or Twitter/X. I think I'll always call that Twitter. I don't care. If you don't mind, please give those social medias a follow or a like, and please rate, download or like this episode wherever you're listening. It really helps grow this podcast and get it out there in the algorithm. I will leave you guys here, but we will meet again for the next episode, which will feature another true crime case. Until then, stay cryptid, stay spooky. Bye, guys.